In the frostbitten halls of Russian palaces, where shadows danced across gilded walls and whispers echoed through endless corridors, a dynasty would rise that would captivate the world for 3 centuries. A family that would build an empire stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, ruling over more land than any monarch in human history. Yet this same bloodline would meet its end in a basement in Siberia, their screams swallowed by gunfire and revolution. This is the story of the Romanovs, Russia's last imperial dynasty. For 300 years, they commanded armies of millions, controlled the fate of peasants and nobles alike, and held the keys to the largest empire the world has ever known. They were crowned in cathedrals of gold, lived in palaces that defied imagination, and wielded power that seemed absolute. But power, as we'll discover, is never truly absolute. And even the mightiest of dynasties can crumble when the ground beneath them shifts. What you're about to witness is more than just the Rise family. This and Fall of a Royal is the story of how a single bloodline shaped the destiny of hundreds of millions of people, how their decisions in opulent throne rooms would echo across battlefields and peasant villages, how their personal dramas would become national tragedies, and how their final moments would mark not just the end of a dynasty, but the birth of a new world order. But here's what most people don't realise about the Romanovs. Their story doesn't begin with crowns and ceremonies. It begins with chaos, with a nation torn apart by civil war, with a teenage boy who would become Tsar not through birthright, but through the desperate choice of a people who had grown tired of anarchy. The year was 1613. Russia was bleeding. For over a decade, the country had been ravaged by what historians would call the time of troubles. Foreign armies marched across Russian soil. Pretenders to the throne emerged like weeds after rain, each claiming divine right to rule. Polish forces occupied Moscow itself, the sacred heart of Russian orthodoxy. The very survival of Russia as an independent nation hung by a thread. In the midst of this chaos, something remarkable happened. The Russian people, from boyars to peasants, from merchants to priests, came together in a way that hadn't been seen for generations. They formed what they called the Second Militia, a massive popular uprising that would drive the foreign invaders from their homeland. But driving out the enemies was only half the battle. Who would rule Russia once the smoke cleared? The answer would come from an assembly unlike any other in Russian history. Representatives from across the vast Russian lands gathered in Moscow for what they called the Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land. Nobles sat beside merchants. Church leaders debated with military commanders. For weeks they argued, they deliberated, they searched for a solution to their nation's leadership crisis. Then, on February 21st, 1613, they made a choice that would echo through the centuries. They chose a 16-year-old boy named Michael Romanov. Now, why they, you might be wondering, picked a teenager to in led a nation crisis? The answer reveals really something power works. Profound about how Michael wasn't chosen because he was the strongest candidated leader or the most experienced. He was chosen precisely because he was weak boy, powerfuler, families, the church leaders, the military commanders, they all believed they could control a young, inexperienced Tsar. They thought they were selecting a puppet. They couldn't have been more wrong. Michael Romanov would prove to be anything but a puppet, and his descendants would build an empire that would dominate the world stage for 3 centuries. But the seeds of their ultimate destruction were planted in that very first choice. Because when you come to power through compromise, when your legitimacy rests on the approval of others, that foundation can crack under pressure. And 300 years later, when the final Romanov Tsar faced his own crisis, he would discover that the loyalty of the people is not something that can be inherited like a crown. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's return to that 16-year-old boy who would become the first Romanov Tsar. Michael Romanov was born into a world of privilege, but also of danger. His family, the Romanovs, were boyars, members of the Russian nobility, but they were far from the most powerful or wealthy noble family in the realm. What they lacked in military might, they made up for in something far more valuable in the treacherous world of Russian court politics. They had survived. During the reign of Ivan the Terrible, when the paranoid Tsar had decimated the ranks of the nobility with his brutal purges, the Romanovs had managed to stay on the right side of the throne. When Ivan's son Fyodor became Tsar, it was a Romanov who served as his closest advisor. And when the direct line of the ancient Rurik dynasty finally died out, the Romanovs were positioned perfectly to make their move. But positioning and opportunity are two different things. The path from noble family to royal dynasty was paved with blood, betrayal, and more than a little bit of luck. The key figure in the Romanov rise to power wasn't actually Michael at all. It was his father, Patriarch Filaret. Now, Filaret's story reads like something out of a political thriller. Born as Fyodor Nikitich Romanov, he had been forced to become a monk by Boris Godunov, who saw the Romanovs as a threat to his own power. But exile to a monastery didn't break Filaret's spirit. Instead, it gave him something even more valuable than noble blood. It gave him the backing of the Russian Orthodox Church. When the time of troubles erupted, Filaret found himself at the centre of the political storm. He was captured by the Poles and held prisoner for years, but his suffering only increased his popularity among the Russian people, who saw him as a martyr for the faith. When the Zemsky Sobor was looking for a new Tsar, they weren't just choosing Michael Romanov, they were choosing the son, Filaret, of the man who had sacrificed everything for Russia. The coronation of Michael Romanov on July 22nd, 1613, marked the beginning of a new era. But the challenges facing the young Tsar were staggering. The treasury Russian was empty. Foreign armies, still nobility, occupied vast territories. The was fractured and suspicious. The peasants were exhausted by years of war and famine. Most rulers would have been overwhelmed by such circumstances. But Michael had something that his predecessors had lacked. He had his father. When Filaret returned from Polish captivity in 1619, he didn't just resume his role as a church leader. He became co-ruler of Russia in all but name. Father and son worked together to rebuild their shattered nation, and their partnership would become the template for Romanov rule for generations to come. The early Romanovs understood something that many of their European counterparts missed. Power in Russia couldn't be wielded from the throne room alone. It required the careful cultivation of relationships with the church, the nobility, and yes, even the common people. Michael and Filaret didn't just rule Russia, they rebuilt it from the ground up. They reformed the military, creating new regiments trained in Western European tactics. They negotiated treaties that ended the wars with Poland and Sweden, securing Russia's borders for the first time in decades. They began the process of centralizing power, bringing the far-flung regions of the Russian Empire under more direct control from Moscow. But perhaps most importantly, they began to craft the image of the Romanov dynasty. They weren't just rulers. They were the saviors of Russia, chosen by God and confirmed by the people to lead the nation out of darkness into a new golden age. This wasn't just propaganda, it was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be Tsar. Previous Russian rulers had claimed authority through conquest or inheritance. The Romanovs claimed authority through service. They positioned themselves as the servants of Russia, chosen to bear the heavy burden of leadership for the good of the nation. It was a brilliant political strategy, and it would sustain the dynasty through 3 centuries of triumph and tragedy. But it also created expectations that would prove impossible to meet. When you claim to rule by divine mandate for the good of the people, what happens when the people decide you're no longer serving their interests? That question would haunt every Romanov Tsar who followed Michael to the throne. But in those early days of the dynasty, such concerns seemed distant and theoretical. The Romanovs had restored order to Russia. They had rebuilt the army, refilled the treasury, and expanded the borders of the empire. They had transformed a nation on the brink of collapse into a rising European power. And they were just getting started. Michael's reign established the foundations of Romanov power, but it was his son who would truly announce the dynasty's arrival on the world stage. Alexis Romanov, who became Tsar in 1645 at the age of 16, inherited a stable kingdom and ambitious dreams. Where his father had focused on survival and rebuilding, Alexis looked outward toward conquest and expansion. The transformation of Russia under the early Romanovs was nothing short of remarkable. In just a few decades, they had taken a nation that had been the laughingstock of Europe and turned it into a force to be reckoned with. But this success would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new pressures that would test the dynasty in ways that Michael and Filaret could never have imagined. The Romanov story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Under Alexis Romanov, the Russian Empire began to reveal its true potential. This wasn't the desperate scrambling for survival that had marked his father's reign. This was calculated expansion, methodical conquest, and the emergence of a new kind of Russian power that would send shockwaves across Europe. But Alexis faced a problem that would plague every Romanov ruler who followed him. How do you maintain absolute power over an empire so vast that it takes months for messages to travel from one end to the other? How do you control territories where local nobles have ruled like kings for generations? How do you transform a collection of conquered lands into a unified nation? The answer would come to define the Romanov approach to governance for the next 2.5 centuries. You don't just rule through fear or tradition. You rule through spectacle, through the creation of a royal mythology so powerful that it becomes its own form of reality. Alexis began this transformation by revolutionizing the very concept of the Russian court. Where previous Tsars had lived in relative simple himself with unprecedentedity, Alexis surrounded luxury. He imported craftsmen from across Europe to build palaces that rivaled Versailles. He established elaborate court ceremonies that turned every royal appearance into a theatrical production. He created a web of rituals and traditions that elevated the Tsar from mere mortal ruler to something approaching divinity. This wasn't vanity. This was statecraft at its most sophisticated. Every golden throne, every jeweled crown, every elaborate ceremony served a political purpose. They demonstrated the power of the Russian Empire to foreign ambassadors. They reinforced the authority of the Tsar among the Russian nobility, and they created a sense of awe and reverence among the common people that would prove remarkably durable. But spectacle alone doesn't build empires. Alexis combined his theatrical innovations with military campaigns that expanded Russian territory at an unprecedented rate. He waged war against Poland, reclaiming territories that had been lost during the time of troubles. He pushed south against the Ottoman Empire, extending Russian influence into the Black Sea region. He sent expeditions into Siberia that would eventually carry the Russian flag all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Each conquest brought new challenges. Each new territory added to the complexity of governing an empire that was becoming truly continental in scope. And each success raised the stakes for the dynasty, creating expectations that would prove increasingly difficult to meet. The most significant expansion came through an unexpected source. In 1654, a Cossack leader named Bohdan Khmelnytsky approached the Russian court with a proposal that would change the course of history. He offered to place the Cossack territories of Ukraine under Russian protection in exchange for military support against Polish domination. Alexis accepted, and with that single decision, he doubled the population under Russian rule and gained control over some of the most fertile agricultural land in Europe. But he also inherited a problem that would haunt the Romanovs for generations. The Ukrainians hadn't asked to become Russian subjects. They had asked for Russian protection. The distinction would prove crucial in the centuries that followed. The Ukrainian alliance marked a turning point in the Romanov approach to empire building. Previous Russian expansions had been primarily about territory and resources. The Ukrainian decision was about something far more ambitious. It was about positioning Russia as the protector of Orthodox Christians throughout Eastern Europe. It was about claiming a religious and cultural mission that extended far beyond Russia's traditional borders. This expansion of Russian influence brought the empire into direct conflict with the established powers of Europe. Poland saw Russian expansion as an existential threat. The Ottoman Empire viewed Russian moves into Ukraine as a challenge to their own imperial ambitions. Sweden began to worry about Russian influence in the Baltic region, and in the background the emerging power of Prussia watched nervously as Russia grew stronger and more assertive. But the most significant consequence of Russian expansion wasn't military or diplomatic, it was social. The rapid growth of the empire created unprecedented opportunities for advancement within Russian society. Military officers who distinguished themselves in the Ukrainian campaigns found themselves elevated to positions of power and privilege. Administrators who could successfully govern the territories became new, indispensable to the crown. Merchants who could navigate the complexities of trade across the expanded empire accumulated vast fortunes. For the first time in Russian history, social mobility became possible on a large scale. The rigid hierarchies that had defined Russian society for centuries began to loosen. New families rose to prominence, while old ones declined. The Romanovs, who had themselves risen from relative obscurity, presided over a transformation of Russian society that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. This social transformation had profound implications for the dynasty itself. The Romanovs were no longer just the rulers of a traditional Russian kingdom. They had become the emperors of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that stretched across continents. They governed Orthodox Russians and Catholic Poles, Muslim Tatars and pagan Siberians, settled farmers and nomadic herders. The challenge of holding such a diverse empire together would test every aspect of Romanov governance. Traditional Russian methods of rule, based on personal relationships and orthodox religious authority, proved inadequate for governing such a complex realm. New systems had to be developed, new institutions had to be created, new forms of legitimacy had to be established. Alexis began this process by reforming the Russian military along Western European lines. He hired foreign officers to train Russian troops in modern tactics and weaponry. He established new regiments equipped with the latest firearms and artillery. He created a professional officer corps that could compete with the best armies in Europe. But military reform was just the beginning. Alexis also began the process of administrative centralization that would become a hallmark of Romanov rule. He established new government departments to oversee different aspects of imperial administration. He created a more systematic approach to tax collection that could fund the growing costs of empire. He began the process of codifying Russian law in ways that could be applied consistently across the vast territories under his control. These reforms created new opportunities for advancement, but they also created new tensions Russian within society. The traditional nobility, who had long enjoyed autonomy in their local regions, found themselves increasingly subject to central authority. The Orthodox Church, which had been a key ally of the early Romanovs, began to worry about the influence of Western ideas and practices on Russian society. The most dramatic manifestation of these tensions came in the form of a religious crisis that would shake the foundations of Russian society. In 1653, Patriarch Nikon, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, announced a series of reforms designed to bring Russian religious practices in line with Greek Orthodox traditions. The changes seemed minor: adjustments to ritual gestures, corrections to prayer books, modifications to church architecture. But the reaction was explosive. Millions of Russians who came to be known as Old Believers rejected the reforms as heretical innovations that violated the pure traditions of Russian Orthodoxy. They saw the changes as evidence of foreign corruption of their sacred traditions. They viewed the reformers as agents of the Antichrist who were preparing the way for the end of the world. The Old Believer schism created the first major internal challenge to Romanov authority since the dynasty had come to power. Entire communities rejected not just the religious reforms, but the authority of the Tsar, who had endorsed them. Some fled to remote regions of the empire to practice their faith in isolation. Others engaged in acts of resistance that bordered on rebellion. The crisis forced Alexis to make a choice that would define the relationship between the Romanov dynasty and Russian society for generations to come. He could side with the traditionalists and preserve social harmony at the cost of religious and administrative reform, or he could support the modernizers and risk a permanent schism within Russian society. Alexis chose modernization, but the cost was enormous. The Old Believer schism would never fully heal, creating a permanent source of internal opposition to Romanov rule. More importantly, it established a pattern that would repeat throughout the dynasty's history. Whenever the Romanovs attempted to reform Russian society, they would face resistance from those who saw change as betrayal of sacred traditions. This tension between modernization and tradition would become the defining characteristic of the Romanov era. Each generation of Romanov rulers would face the same fundamental question. How do you modernize an empire without destroying the very foundations of your authority? How do you embrace change without losing control of the forces that change unleashes? The answers to these questions would shape the destiny of Russia for the next 2.5 centuries. They would influence decisions about war and peace, reform and reaction, expansion and consolidation. And ultimately, they would determine whether the Romanov dynasty would survive the challenges of a rapidly changing world. But in the reign of Alexis, these long-term consequences remained hidden beneath the immediate successes of imperial expansion and administrative reform. Russia was growing stronger, wealthier, and more influential with each passing year. The Romanov name was becoming synonymous with Russian power and prestige. The future looked bright for the dynasty that had rescued Russia from the chaos of the time of troubles. Yet beneath the surface, the contradictions that would eventually destroy the Romanov Empire were already beginning to emerge. The tensions between autocracy and modernization, between Russian tradition and European innovation, between imperial ambition and social stability, were growing stronger with each passing decade. The next generation of Romanov rulers would inherit not just an empire, but a series of unsolved problems that would test their dynasty in ways that Alexis could never have anticipated. And at the center of these challenges would be a young man whose reign would transform Russia into a European great power while simultaneously planting the seeds of the dynasty's eventual destruction. The shadows were already gathering the throne around when Peter Alexeyevich was born in 1672. The future Peter the Great entered a world where the Romanov dynasty appeared to be at the height of its power. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the gilded surface of imperial success, forces were stirring that would either elevate Russia to unprecedented greatness or tear the empire apart at its foundations. Peter's early years were marked by violence that would have broken lesser men. When his father Alexis died in 1676, the succession crisis that followed revealed just how fragile the Romanov hold on power really was. Two of Alexis's sons had legitimate claims to the throne. Ivan, the elder, was weak and sickly. Peter, though younger, showed signs of the fierce intelligence and boundless energy that would define his reign. The struggle for succession erupted into open warfare in the streets of Moscow. The Streltsy, the traditional palace guard, rose in rebellion, massacring members of Peter's family before his 10-year-old eyes. The young prince watched as his relatives were thrown from palace windows onto the spears of the rebels below. Blood pooled on the cobblestones of the Kremlin as the mob decided who would rule Russia. This wasn't a distant political crisis happening in some far-off throne room. This was personal trauma that seared itself into Peter's memory. The lesson he learned wasn't about diplomacy or compromise. It was about power. Raw, brutal, undeniable power. Either you wielded it completely or others would use it to destroy you. The resolution came through his half-sister Sophia, who seized control as regent for both brothers. For 7 years, Peter lived in the shadow of her rule, officially co-tsar, but effectively powerless. These weren't years of idle luxury. They were years of preparation, of learning, of building the skills and alliances that would eventually allow him to claim his birthright. Peter spent these formative years in the German quarter of Moscow, surrounded by European merchants, craftsmen, and military advisors. While other Russian nobles dismissed these foreigners as curiosities, Peter absorbed their knowledge like a sponge. He learned about shipbuilding from Dutch carpenters. He studied military engineering with German officers. He explored mathematics and science with scholars who had travelled from across Europe to seek their fortunes in Russia. This European education wasn't just about acquiring technical knowledge. It was about discovering a completely different way of thinking about power, governance, and the relationship between ruler and subjects. The Europeans didn't just serve their monarchs out of tradition or religious obligation, they served because those monarchs had proven themselves capable of delivering results. Military victories, economic prosperity, technological advancement, cultural achievement. The contrast with traditional Russian governance couldn't have been more stark. Russian nobles served the Tsar because their ancestors had always served his ancestors. Russian peasants obeyed because the Orthodox Church taught them that the Tsar was God's representative on earth. Russian merchants followed imperial edicts because disobedience meant death or exile. But what happened when tradition failed? What happened when divine authority wasn't enough to solve practical problems? What happened when the old ways of doing things simply stopped working? These questions would obsess Peter for the rest of his life, and his answers would transform not just Russia, but the entire balance of power in Europe and Asia. The opportunity to his ideas put into practice came in 1689 when Sophia's regency finally collapsed. Peter was 17 years old, tall enough to tower over most men, strong enough to bend iron bars with his bare hands, and intelligent enough to see that Russia was falling dangerously behind the rest of Europe in almost every measurable way. The military that had conquered Ukraine and pushed back the Poles was becoming obsolete as European armies adopted new tactics and technologies. The economy that had funded Alexis's expansion was stagnating as trade routes shifted and new forms of commerce emerged. The administrative system that had governed the empire was breaking down under the sheer complexity of managing territories that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. Peter's response was characteristically direct. If Russia was falling behind Europe, then Russia would learn from Europe. If Russian methods weren't working, then Russian methods would change. If the nobility resisted modernization, then the nobility would be forced to modernize. The young Tsar's first target was the military. He disbanded the unreliable Streltsy regiments that had terrorized his childhood and replaced them with new units trained according to European standards. He imported foreign officers to teach Russian soldiers how to use modern weapons and tactics. He established military schools to create a professional officer corps that could compete with the best armies in the world. But Peter understood that military reform without economic reform was pointless. You couldn't fund a modern army with a medieval economy. So he launched a systematic campaign to transform how Russia generated wealth and power. He encouraged the development of new industries by offering tax incentives to entrepreneurs who established factories and workshops. He reformed the currency system to make trade easier and more predictable. He built new roads and canals to improve transportation across the vast empire. He established state monopolies on key commodities like salt and alcohol to generate revenue for government projects. Most importantly, he began the process of creating a new kind of Russian nobility. Instead of inheriting their positions based on ancient bloodlines, nobles would earn their ranks through service to the state. Military officers who distinguished themselves in battle could rise to positions of power and privilege. Civil administrators who efficiently managed their territories could accumulate wealth and influence. Even merchants and craftsmen who contributed to the empire's prosperity could gain access to social circles that had been closed to them for centuries. This wasn't just administrative reform, it was social revolution. Peter was dismantling the foundation of Russian society and rebuilding it according to principles of merit and achievement, rather than birth and tradition. The reaction was swift and violent. Traditional nobles saw their ancient privileges under attack. Orthodox priests warned that foreign innovations were corrupting the pure Russian faith. Peasants and merchants struggled to adapt to new laws and regulations that changed faster than they could understand. But Peter had learned the lesson of his childhood trauma well. Opposition would be crushed, not negotiated with. When the Streltsy attempted another rebellion in 1698, he personally supervised the execution of over 1,000 rebels. He forced the nobility to adopt European dress and customs, going so far as to personally cut the beards of nobles who clung to traditional Russian appearance. He relocated the capital from Moscow to a new city that he would build from scratch according to European architectural principles. That new capital would be called St. Petersburg, and its construction would epitomize everything that was both brilliant and terrible about Peter's approach to modernization. The city would be built in a swamp, in one of the harshest climates in Europe, using forced labor that would cost tens of thousands of lives. But it would also become one of the most beautiful cities in the world, a testament to human ambition and artistic achievement that would rival Paris or London. St. Petersburg wasn't just a new capital, it was a statement. Russia would no longer be content to be a backward, isolated kingdom on the periphery of European civilization. It would become a great power that demanded recognition and respect from the established monarchies of the West. But building a great power required more than impressive architecture and modern armies. It required proving Russian strength against European opponents who had long dismissed the Tsars as barbarian rulers of a barbarous people. The test would come in the form of the Great Northern War, a conflict that would last for over 2 decades and determine whether Russia would emerge as a major European power or collapse back into the chaos and weakness that had marked the time of troubles. The war began in 1700 with what appeared to be a catastrophic defeat for Russian arms. At the Battle of Narva, a Swedish army led by the teenage King Charles XII crushed a much larger Russian force, capturing most of Peter's artillery and killing or capturing thousands of his newly trained soldiers. European observers declared the experiment in Russian modernization a failure. The traditional powers breathed sighs of relief. Russia would remain a peripheral kingdom unable to challenge the established order in European politics. They underestimated both Peter's determination and his capacity to learn from failure. The Tsar used the defeat at Narva not as an excuse to retreat, but as motivation to accelerate his reforms. He rebuilt the army with even more foreign advisors and modern equipment. He expanded the military schools to train more professional officers. He increased taxes and forced labor to fund the expanded military effort. Most importantly, he refused to give up. While Charles XII became distracted by campaigns in Poland and other theatres, Peter methodically reclaimed the territories lost in the early years of the war. Russian forces learned to avoid pitched battles where Swedish tactical superiority could decide the outcome. Instead, they engaged in a campaign of attrition that gradually wore down Swedish resources and morale. The culmination came at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. Charles Confident led an over 12, wounded his army deep into Ukrainian territory where Peter was waiting with a force that had been transformed by a decade of continuous warfare. The battle was a complete reversal of Narva. This time it was the Russians who crushed their enemies, capturing thousands of Swedish soldiers and forcing Charles XII to flee to the Ottoman Empire. The victory announced Russia's arrival as a great power in the most decisive way possible. They had defeated the army that had been considered the finest in Europe. But military victory was only the beginning of Peter's transformation of Russia's international position. He used his newfound strength to secure access to the Baltic Sea, giving Russia the warm water ports that had been denied to previous Tsars. He established diplomatic relations with major European powers on terms of equality rather than subordination. He began the process of Russian expansion into territories that had never before been under Tsarist control. By the end of Peter's reign in 1725, Russia had been transformed from a peripheral kingdom into an empire that stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, from the Baltic to the Pacific. The Romanov dynasty now ruled over territories larger than any other in human monarchy history. But this expansion came at an enormous cost. The constant warfare had drained the treasury and exhausted the population. The forced modernization had created deep social tensions that would never fully heal. The brutal suppression of opposition had left the regime dependent on fear and force rather than genuine loyalty. Most ominously, Peter's reforms had created expectations that his successors might not be able to meet. He had proven that Russia could become a great power through determined leadership and ruthless modernization. But what would happen when that leadership faltered? What would happen when the next generation of Romanov rulers lacked Peter's vision, his energy, or his willingness to pay any price for success? These questions would haunt the dynasty for the next 2 centuries. Peter had given the Romanovs an empire, but he had also given them a burden that would eventually prove impossible to bear. The man who had transformed Russia through sheer force of will died as he had lived, suddenly and dramatically. Peter's death in 1725 left behind an empire in transition, a nobility divided between modernizers and traditionalists, and a succession crisis that would determine whether his reforms would survive or be swept away by the forces of reaction. The next phase of the Romanov story would reveal whether Peter's transformation of Russia was a permanent achievement or simply the personal accomplishment of a single extraordinary ruler. The dynasty that had risen from obscurity to rule the largest empire in the world now faced its greatest test. Would they prove worthy of the legacy that Peter the Great had left them? The answer would reshape the map of Europe and determine the fate of millions of people across 3 continents. The throne that Peter the Great left behind in 1725 was more than just a seat of power. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. For all his military genius and transformative vision, Peter had failed to solve the most fundamental problem facing any dynasty. Who comes next? The succession crisis that erupted after Peter's death revealed the inherent weakness at the heart of absolute monarchy. When power is concentrated in a single person, what happens when that person dies without leaving clear instructions? When the fate of an empire depends on the whims of one individual, what prevents ambitious nobles from tearing that empire apart in their scramble for control? Peter's natural heir should have been his son Alexis, but that relationship had ended in tragedy that haunted the final years of the great Tsar's reign. Alexis had opposed his father's reforms, preferring the traditional Russian ways that Peter was so determined to destroy. The conflict between father and son became a proxy war between the old Russia and the new, between those who wanted to preserve ancient traditions and those who embraced radical change. The confrontation reached its climax when Alexis fled to Austria, seeking protection from European powers who were only too happy to embarrass the rising Russian Empire. Peter's rage was volcanic. The Tsarevich hadn't just defied his father, he had committed treason against the state, seeking foreign intervention against Russian interests. When Alexis was finally persuaded to return to Russia, he faced interrogation that revealed the depth of opposition to Peter's reforms among traditional Russian elites. Under torture, he confessed to plotting against his father's government and hoping for the restoration of the old ways. The revelations shattered Peter's faith in his own nobility and convinced him that his reforms would never be safe as long as traditionalist forces had a potential leader around whom to rally. The solution was as brutal as it was definitive. Alexis died in the Peter and Paul fortress in 1718, officially from illness brought on by the stress of interrogation. Unofficially, most observers believed that Peter had ordered the execution of his own son, rather than risk the destruction of everything he had built. The decision haunted Peter for the remaining 7 years of his life. He had secured his reforms, but at the cost of destroying his own dynasty's future. When he died in 1725, the succession passed not to a direct male heir, but to his widow Catherine, a former servant who had risen to become empress through intelligence, charm, and an intimate understanding of how power really worked in the new Russia that Peter had created. Catherine's reign as Catherine I lasted only 2 years, but those 2 years established a pattern that would define Russian politics for the rest of the 18th century. The throne would pass not necessarily to the most legitimate heir, but to whoever could command the loyalty of the military units that controlled the capital. The guards regiments that Peter had created to protect his reforms became the kingmakers who decided which member of the Romanov family would actually rule. This wasn't the stable succession system that most European monarchies had developed over centuries. This was something closer to organized chaos, where each change of ruler brought the possibility of dramatic shifts and personnel in policy. The result was a series of palace coups, sudden reversals of fortune, and rapid changes in the direction of Russian development that would have been unthinkable under the iron control that Peter had exercised. When Catherine I died in 1727, the throne passed to Peter II, the 12-year-old grandson of Peter the Great, through the murdered Alexis. But the boy Tsar was controlled by noble factions who had opposed many of Peter's reforms, and his brief reign saw attempts to roll back the modernization program that had defined the previous quarter century. The capital was moved back to Moscow from St. Petersburg. Foreign advisors were dismissed from government positions. The military reforms that had won the Great Northern War were modified to satisfy traditional Russian military customs. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the old Russia might reassert itself against the new. But Peter II died of smallpox in 1730 at the age of 14, and with his death, the direct male line of the Romanov dynasty came to an end. The succession crisis that followed would determine not just who would rule Russia, but what kind of Russia they would rule. The solution came from an unexpected source. The Supreme Privy Council, a group of powerful nobles who had effectively controlled policy during Peter II's minority, decided to offer the throne to Anna Ivanovna, the daughter of Peter the Great's deceased brother Ivan V. But their offer came with conditions that would have transformed Russia from an absolute monarchy into something resembling a constitutional system. Anna would rule, but only under strict limitations. She could not marry without the council's permission. She could not name her own successor. She could not declare war, make peace, or impose new taxes without their approval. Most importantly, she could not punish nobles without trial or confiscate their property without legal justification. The offer seemed perfect from the nobles' perspective. They would have a legitimate Romanov on the throne, but that Romanov would be their puppet rather than their master. The age of absolute czarist power would end, replaced by a system where the nobility shared power with the monarch. There was just one problem with their plan. Anna Ivanovna had spent the previous 19 years as the Duchess of Courland, a small Baltic territory where she had learned firsthand how European politics really worked. She understood that power offered with conditions attached could be withdrawn just as easily. And she had no intention of becoming a ceremonial figurehead while others made the real decisions about Russia's future. Anna accepted the council's offer and travelled to Moscow for her coronation. But once she arrived in the capital, she discovered that the Supreme Privy Council's attempt to limit monarchical power had created a backlash among other segments of Russian society. Military officers who owed their positions to Peter's merit-based reforms feared that a noble-dominated government would reverse their advancement. Merchants and administrators who had prospered under the new system worried that traditional nobles would restore the old economic arrangements that had benefited only the landed aristocracy. Most importantly, the Guards regiments that controlled Moscow remained loyal to the principle of absolute monarchy that had been established by Peter the Great. They might accept a new ruler, but they would not accept a weak ruler who could be controlled by the same noble families that had opposed Peter's modernization program. Anna waited until she had secured the loyalty of the Guards regiments, then made her move. In a dramatic ceremony at the Kremlin, she publicly tore up the conditions that the Supreme Privy Council had imposed on her rule. The nobles who had thought they were installing a puppet found themselves facing an autocrat who was determined to exercise the full powers of the Romanov throne. The coup was bloodless but decisive. The Supreme Privy Council was dissolved. Its members were exiled or demoted to minor positions. The experiment in constitutional monarchy that might have changed the entire course of Russian history was over before it had really begun. Anna's reign from 1730 to 1740 established the template for 18th century Russian politics. The Romanov dynasty would continue to rule with absolute power, but that power would be exercised by whoever could command the loyalty of the military forces that controlled the capital. Blood relationships to previous czars mattered less than political skill and the ability to manage the complex coalitions that surrounded the throne. This system produced remarkable flexibility in Russian governance. Unlike other European monarchies where incompetent rulers could drag their kingdoms into decline for decades, Russia developed a mechanism for replacing ineffective leaders relatively quickly. But it also created chronic instability at the highest levels of government, where policies could change dramatically with each new ruler and long-term planning became almost impossible. Anna's own illustrate reigned both the strengths and weaknesses of this system. She was an effective administrator who continued many of Peter's modernization programs while avoiding the social tensions that had marked his rule. She expanded Russian territory through successful wars against the Ottoman Empire. She patronized arts and culture in ways that began the transformation of St. Petersburg into one of Europe's most sophisticated capitals. But she was also a foreign ruler in the eyes of many Russians. Her 19 years in Courland had made her more comfortable with European customs than with Russian traditions. She relied heavily on foreign advisors, particularly Germans from the Baltic provinces who had no deep roots in Russian society. Her court spoke French and German more often than Russian, creating resentment among traditional Russian nobles who felt excluded from power their own country. When Anna died in 1740, she attempted to solve the succession problem by naming her infant nephew Ivan VI as her heir, with his mother Anna Leopoldovna serving as regent. But a regency for a baby Tsar created exactly the kind of power vacuum that invited intervention by ambitious rivals. The intervention came from an unexpected source. Elizabeth Petrovna, the daughter of Peter the Great and Catherine I, had been excluded from the succession by the various political arrangements that had followed her parents' deaths. But she had spent 2 decades building relationships with the Guards regiments and positioning herself as the representative of her father's legacy. On November 25, 1741, Elizabeth led a midnight coup that overthrew the regency and placed herself on the throne. The Guards regiments that had brought Anna to power now transferred their loyalty to the daughter of the Tsar they remembered as Russia's greatest ruler. Elizabeth's coup was more than just another palace revolution. It represented the triumph of a specifically Russian faction over the German-dominated court that had surrounded Anna. The new empress promised to restore Russian traditions and Russian personnel to positions of authority. She would continue Peter's modernization program, but she would do so in ways that respected Russian customs and Russian interests. The promise proved remarkably durable. Elizabeth's reign from 1741 to 1761 became known as one of the most successful in Russian history. She avoided major wars while strengthening Russia's international position through careful diplomacy. She promoted Russian culture and education while maintaining the economic and military reforms that had made Russia a European power. She managed the nobility with a combination of firmness and flexibility that avoided both rebellion and stagnation. Most importantly, Elizabeth solved the succession problem that had plagued Russia since Peter's death. She chose her nephew, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, to be her heir and arranged for him to marry a German princess who would be brought to Russia and converted to Orthodox Christianity. The arrangement would provide legitimate succession while ensuring that future rulers would be raised in Russian traditions rather than foreign courts. The German princess who became Catherine Alexeyevna would prove to be one of the most remarkable figures in Russian history. But in 1741, she was simply a 14-year-old girl whose marriage would be arranged to serve the political needs of the Romanov dynasty. Nobody could have predicted that this teenage bride would eventually become Catherine the Great, the ruler who would expand the Russian Empire to its greatest territorial extent and establish the Romanovs as one of the dominant royal families in European politics. The transformation of Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg into one of history's most powerful women was still years in the future. But the mechanisms that would make that transformation possible were already in place. The Romanov system of succession through palace politics rather than strict hereditary succession had created opportunities for exceptional individuals to rise to power regardless of their original social position. The Guards regiments had learned that their loyalty could determine who ruled the Russian Empire. The nobility had discovered that opposition to effective rulers was futile, but that weak rulers could be replaced. Most importantly, the Russian Empire itself had become too large and too complex to be governed by traditional methods. Future rulers would need exceptional skill, determination, and vision to manage territories that stretched across 11 time zones and included dozens of different ethnic and religious groups. The stage was set for the next phase of the Romanov story, a phase that would see the dynasty reach heights of power and cultural achievement that would rival any royal family in world history. But it was also a phase that would reveal the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the Romanov system, contradictions that would eventually prove impossible to resolve. The teenage German princess who arrived in Russia in 1744 to marry Elizabeth's heir had no way of knowing that she was entering a dynasty whose greatest triumphs and most devastating failures still lay ahead. She could not have imagined that her own reign would epitomize both the magnificent achievements and the fatal weaknesses that would ultimately destroy the family that had ruled Russia for over 2 centuries. The Romanov story was approaching its golden age, but that golden age would cast shadows that would eventually engulf the entire dynasty in darkness. The young woman who stepped off the carriage in St. Petersburg in 1744 bore little resemblance to the empress she would become. Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg was 15 years old, spoke no Russian, and had been raised in one of Germany's most insignificant principalities. Her father ruled over territories so small that most European maps didn't bother to label them. Her mother's greatest achievement had been arranging this marriage to the heir of the Russian throne. But Sophie possessed something that couldn't be measured by the size of her father's domains or the wealth of her family's treasury. She had an intelligence that bordered on genius and an ambition that would have impressed even Peter the Great himself. Within weeks of arriving in Russia, she was studying the Russian language with an intensity that amazed her tutors. Within months, she had converted to Russian orthodoxy with a devotion that convinced even skeptical priests of her sincerity. The conversion ceremony revealed the first glimpse of the political mind that would eventually reshape Europe. When Sophie renounced her Lutheran faith and embraced orthodoxy, she wasn't just changing religions, she was declaring her complete identification with Russian interests over German ones. She was positioning herself as more Russian than many of the nobles who had been born in the empire. The symbolism was unmistakable when she took the name Catherine Alexeyevna. She wasn't just adopting a Russian name, she was claiming spiritual descent from Catherine I, the former servant who had become Peter the Great's widow and successor. The message was clear to anyone who understood Russian court politics. This foreign princess intended to become not just the wife of a future Tsar, but a Russian ruler in her own right. Her marriage to the Grand Duke Peter in 1745 seemed to confirm the success of Elizabeth's succession planning. The dynasty now had a legitimate heir and a bride who had demonstrated her commitment to Russian traditions. The future of the Romanov line appeared secure for the first time since Peter the Great's death 20 years earlier. But appearances, as the Romanov dynasty had learned repeatedly, could be devastatingly deceptive. The Grand Duke Peter was everything that his bride was not. Where Catherine threw herself into mastering Russian culture and politics, Peter remained stubbornly German in his outlook and preferences. Where Catherine cultivated relationships with Russian nobles and Orthodox priests, Peter surrounded himself with Holstein advisors who shared his contempt for Russian customs. Where Catherine studied the complexities of governing the vast Russian Empire, Peter played with toy soldiers and dreamed of military campaigns that would prove his worth as a commander. The contrast became more pronounced as the years passed. Catherine gave birth to the future Paul I in 1754, securing the dynasty's continuation while simultaneously demonstrating her fertility and her commitment to her adopted homeland. She used the years of waiting to build networks of support among the Guards regiments, the nobility and the church hierarchy that would prove crucial when the moment for action arrived. Peter, meanwhile, alienated every significant faction in Russian society. His admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia was seen as treasonous by military officers who had fought against Prussian armies. His plans to reform the Orthodox Church along Lutheran lines horrified the clergy who had welcomed Catherine's conversion. His intention to abandon Russian territorial gains to focus on Holstein's insignificant disputes with Denmark enraged nobles who had profited from imperial expansion. The fundamental problem wasn't just that Peter was unpopular. The problem was that he represented everything the Russian elite had learned to fear about weak or misguided leadership. The memory of the time of troubles remained fresh in Russian political consciousness. The nobility remembered what happened when central authority collapsed and foreign powers intervened in Russian affairs. They had seen how quickly a great empire could disintegrate when it was led by rulers who didn't understand the forces that held this together. Catherine understood fears because she had studied Russian history with the same intensity that she had applied to learning the Russian language. She knew that successful Russian rulers didn't just command obedience through force or tradition. They earned loyalty by demonstrating their commitment to Russian greatness and their competence in advancing Russian interests. When Elizabeth died in January 1761, Peter inherited a throne that he was spectacularly unprepared to occupy. His first acts as Peter III confirmed every fear that Russian elites had harboured about his fitness to rule. He immediately negotiated peace with Prussia, abandoning territorial gains that had cost thousands of Russian lives. He began preparations to attack Denmark on behalf of Holstein interests that had nothing to do with Russian strategic needs. He announced his intention to secularize church lands, threatening the economic foundation of the Orthodox hierarchy that had supported the dynasty for generations. Most dangerously, he alienated the Guards regiments that had become the ultimate arbiters of Russian succession disputes. Peter's Germanic military reforms struck at the heart of the regimental traditions that had made these units the most reliable supporters of Romanov rule. His plan to deploy the Guards in a war against Denmark would have removed them from the capital at precisely the moment when their loyalty was most crucial. The crisis reached its climax in June 1762, when Peter announced his intention to divorce Catherine and marry his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. The decision wasn't just personal scandal, it was political suicide. Catherine had become the symbol of legitimate succession and Russian continuity. Divorcing her would have severed the dynasty's connection to Elizabeth's legacy and opened the succession to challenge by any ambitious noble with a plausible claim to the throne. Catherine's response demonstrated the political skills that would define her reign. Instead of waiting for Peter to act against her, she moved first. On June 28, 1762, she left the palace at dawn and travelled to the barracks of the Izmailovsky Regiment, one of the Guards units that had grown increasingly hostile to Peter's policies. The speech she gave to the assembled soldiers was a masterpiece of political theatre. She didn't present herself as a foreign princess seeking to usurp the throne from its rightful occupant. She presented herself as the defender of Russian orthodoxy, Russian military honour, and Russian imperial greatness against a ruler who had betrayed all three. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Izmailovsky regiment declared for Catherine. Within hours, other Guards regiments had joined the movement. By afternoon, she had returned to St. Petersburg, at the head of a military procession that included not just the Guards regiments, but representatives of the nobility, the church, and even the common people of the capital. Peter's reign lasted exactly 6 months. His overthrow was so swift and complete that he barely had time to understand what was happening before he found himself a prisoner in his own empire. The man who had inherited one of the most powerful thrones in Europe was reduced to pleading for his life within hours of Catherine's arrival in the capital. The official story was that Peter died of a hemorrhoidal colic 8 days after his abdication. The unofficial reality was that Catherine's supporters had eliminated the only person who could serve as a focal point for opposition to her rule. The murder of Peter III was the price that had to be paid for the stability of the new regime. Catherine's coronation as Catherine II in September 1762 marked the beginning of the most successful period in Romanov history. But it also marked the triumph of a pattern that had been developing since Peter the Great's death. The Russian throne no longer passed automatically from parent to child. It went to whoever could command the loyalty of the forces that really controlled the empire. This system had produced remarkable rulers like Elizabeth and now Catherine, but it had also normalized the use of violence in succession disputes and established the precedent that incompetent rulers could be removed by force. The same mechanisms that brought Catherine to power could potentially be used against her or her successors if they failed to maintain the support of the military and political elite. Catherine understood these realities better than perhaps any previous Romanov ruler. Her reign would be defined by her efforts to strengthen the dynasty by expanding the empire, reforming the government, and creating a cultural legacy that would make Russia the equal of any European power. But it would also be defined by her that her authority, constant awareness rested on her ability to satisfy the expectations of constituencies that had proven willing to overthrow rulers who disappointed them. The golden age of the Romanov dynasty was about to begin under the leadership of a German princess who had become more Russian than most Russians. But that golden age would be built on foundations that contain the seeds of future instability. The same forces that had elevated Catherine to power would continue to operate long after her death, creating pressures that would eventually prove impossible for her descendants to manage. The transformation of Sophie from Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg into Catherine the Great was complete. The question now was whether the empire she was about to build would prove more durable than the political system that had brought her to power. The next phase of the Romanov story would provide the answer, revealing both the magnificent achievements and the fatal contradictions that would ultimately determine the dynasty's fate. Catherine's first challenge was to prove that she was more than just another palace revolutionary who had seized power through military force. She needed to demonstrate that her reign would deliver the kind of results that would justify the violent overthrow of a legitimate Tsar. The Russian elite had supported her coup because they believed she would be a more effective ruler than Peter III. Now she had to prove them right. The test came sooner than anyone expected. Within 2 years of her coronation, Catherine faced a crisis that would have destroyed a weaker ruler. A pretender claiming to be the murdered Peter III appeared in the Ural Mountains and began gathering support among Cossacks, Old Believers, and other groups that had grievances against the central government. Emelian Pugachev wasn't just another false claimant to the Russian throne. He was the leader of what became the largest peasant rebellion in Russian history. His movement attracted hundreds of thousands of followers who saw him as the legitimate Tsar come to liberate them from the oppression of nobles and officials. The rebellion spread across vast territories in the Volga region and threatened to march on Moscow itself. For Catherine, the Pugachev rebellion was both a mortal threat and a defining opportunity. If she failed to suppress the uprising, her reign would end the same way it had begun, with military force determining who ruled Russia. But if she succeeded in crushing the rebellion, she would prove her competence as a ruler and her right to occupy the throne she had seized through coup. The suppression of Pugachev required every skill that Catherine had developed during her rise to power. She had to coordinate military campaigns across thousands of miles of territory. She had to maintain the loyalty of nobles who were terrified by the scale of peasant uprising. She had to manage the financial costs of warfare while avoiding the kind of tax increases that might spark additional rebellions. Most importantly, she had to demonstrate that her government was strong enough to protect the interests of the social groups that supported her rule. The nobility needed to see that Catherine could defend their property and privileges against popular uprising. The church needed to see that she would protect Orthodox Christianity against Old Believer dissent. The military needed to see that she could compete and provide leadership in a crisis that threatened the empire's survival. Catherine's success in meeting these challenges established her credentials as one of Russia's great rulers. The Pugachev rebellion was crushed by 1775. The pretender himself was captured, brought to Moscow in a cage, and executed in Red Square. The peasant armies that had threatened to overturn the social order were dispersed or destroyed. But the rebellion had revealed something disturbing about the nature of Catherine's rule and the Romanov system more generally. The empire that appeared so powerful from the outside was actually held together by force and fear, rather than genuine loyalty or shared identity. Millions of subjects had rallied to an obvious imposter because they preferred even fake liberation to continue their subjugation under existing system. Catherine drew the logical conclusion from this revelation. If the empire couldn't inspire genuine loyalty from its subjects, then it would have to be held together through a combination of superior force and more effective administration. The rest of her reign would be dedicated to strengthening both the military power and the governmental efficiency that could prevent future challenges to Romanov authority. The expansion of Russian territory under Catherine exceeded even the achievements of Peter the Great. Her armies conquered the Crimean Peninsula, extending Russian power to the Black Sea and eliminating a source of raids and instability that had plagued the empire for centuries. Her generals pushed Russian borders south into territories that had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire for generations. In the west, Catherine's forces participated in the partitions of Poland that eliminated one of Russia's traditional rivals and brought millions of new subjects under Romanov rule. By the end of her reign, the Russian Empire had grown by over 200,000 square miles, adding territories that included some of the most fertile agricultural land and strategically important ports in Europe. But territorial expansion was only part of Catherine's strategy for strengthening the dynasty. She also launched an ambitious program of administrative reform designed to make the empire more efficient and more responsive to the needs of its diverse population. Her nakaz, or instruction, attempted to codify a comprehensive legal system based on Enlightenment principles of rational governance and individual rights. The attempt to implement Enlightenment ideals in Russian conditions revealed the fundamental contradictions at the heart of Catherine's reign. She genuinely believed in many of the principles that European philosophers advocated. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot. She patronized arts and education. She attempted to create legal protections for subjects who had traditionally been at the mercy of arbitrary authority. But she also recognized that implementing these ideals too quickly or too completely would destabilize the social system that supported her rule. The nobility that had brought her to power expected to maintain their privileges over their serfs. The church that had blessed her coronation expected to preserve its authority over religious matters. The military that enforced her will expected to continue receiving the rewards that came with imperial expansion. The result was a reign that combined genuine reform with fundamental conservatism, progressive ideals with traditional practices, enlightened rhetoric with autocratic reality. Catherine expanded educational opportunities while maintaining serfdom. She promoted legal equality while preserving noble privileges. She encouraged intellectual inquiry while suppressing political dissent. This balancing act required constant adjustment and extraordinary political skill. Catherine had to satisfy the expectations of European intellectuals who saw her as a philosopher queen, while maintaining the loyalty of Russian elites who cared more about their immediate interests than about abstract principles. She had to project an image of enlightened governance while exercising the kind of absolute power that Enlightenment thinkers theoretically opposed. The success of this balancing act made Catherine's reign appear to be the golden age of the Romanov dynasty. Russia had never been larger, more powerful, or more respected in European politics. The capital of St. Petersburg had become one of the most beautiful cities in the world, rivaling Paris and London in its architectural splendor and cultural sophistication. The Russian court attracted visitors from across Europe who marveled at the wealth, refinement, and intellectual vitality of the empire that had once been dismissed as a backward barbarian kingdom. But beneath this glittering surface, the contradictions that Catherine had managed through political skill were creating pressures that would prove increasingly difficult for her successors to handle. The expansion of serfdom that had financed territorial conquest had created a peasant population that was increasingly resentful of their bondage. The growth of an educated nobility that had been exposed to Enlightenment ideas was creating expectations for political participation that conflicted with autocratic governance. Most ominously, the success of Catherine's reign had raised expectations for what the Romanov dynasty could accomplish. Future rulers would be measured against the standards she had established. They would be expected to expand the empire, reform the government, patronize culture, and maintain Russia's position as a great power while somehow resolving the social contradictions that Catherine had been able to manage but not eliminate. The challenge would prove beyond the capabilities of most of her successors. The golden age that Catherine had created would cast shadows that would eventually engulf the entire dynasty in revolution and destruction. But in the 1790s, as Catherine approached the end of her remarkable reign, such concerns seemed distant and theoretical. The Russian Empire appeared to be at the height of its power and prosperity. The Romanov dynasty seemed more secure than it had ever been. The future looked bright for the family that had transformed a troubled kingdom into one of the world's great empires. The reality would prove far different. The forces that Catherine had unleashed through her reforms and conquests would continue to operate long after her death, creating challenges that would test the dynasty in ways that even she could not have anticipated. The Golden Age was ending, though few recognized the signs of approaching crisis. The stage was set for the final act of the Romanov drama, a century-long struggle between the forces of change and tradition that would ultimately determine not just the fate of a single dynasty, but the future of Russia itself. Catherine's death in 1796 brought to an end the most glorious chapter in Romanov history, but it also marked the beginning of the dynasty's most perilous period. The empress who had expanded Russia's borders to their greatest extent and elevated the empire to unprecedented heights of cultural achievement, left behind a succession that would test every assumption about how the Romanov system actually worked. The man who inherited Catherine's throne was not the ruler she had hoped to create. Paul I had spent 34 years waiting to become Tsar, 34 years watching his mother wield the power that should have been his, 34 years nursing grievances and developing theories about how Russia should be governed. When he finally ascended the throne, he brought with him a bitterness that would poison his relationship with the very elites who had made his mother's reign so successful. Paul's first acts as Tsar revealed the depth of his resentment toward Catherine's legacy. Where she had courted the nobility with privileges and honours, he imposed strict regulations that treated them like servants. Where she had maintained the flexible administrative system that allowed regional adaptation, he demanded rigid adherence to detailed protocols that he personally supervised. Where she had projected confidence and stability, he exhibited paranoia and unpredictability that made everyone around him fear for their positions and their lives. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. Catherine had understood that successful autocracy required the illusion of benevolence, the careful cultivation of loyalty through rewards and recognition. Paul seemed to believe that successful autocracy required only fear, that subjects would obey more completely if they never knew when arbitrary punishment might fall upon them. This approach might have worked in a smaller, simpler state where the ruler could personally monitor every aspect of governance. But the Russian Empire that Paul inherited was too vast and too complex to be micromanaged from St. Petersburg. His attempts to impose detailed control over every administrative decision created bottlenecks that paralysed government departments. His constant changes of personnel and policy created uncertainty that made long-term planning impossible. More dangerously, Paul's erratic behaviour alienated the Guards regiments that had been the ultimate arbiters of Russian succession disputes for over half a century. These elite units had brought Catherine to power and sustained her through the crises of her early reign. They expected to be treated with the respect due to the protectors of the dynasty. Instead, Paul subjected them to the same arbitrary discipline that he imposed on everyone else in his government. The breaking point came in 1801 when Paul's foreign policy decisions convinced the Guards officers that he had become a threat to Russian national interests. His alliance with Napoleon Bonaparte struck them as a betrayal of everything Russia had fought for during the previous century. His plans to invade British-controlled India seemed like a mad adventure that would drain Russian resources for no strategic benefit. His increasingly isolated and suspicious behaviour suggested that he was losing touch with the realities of governing a great power. The conspiracy that formed against Paul included some of the most distinguished names in Russian aristocracy. Count Peter Paulin, the military governor of St. Petersburg, coordinated the plot with a combination of idealism and pragmatism that revealed how thoroughly Paul had lost the confidence of his own government. These weren't revolutionary radicals seeking to overthrow the monarchy. They were loyal servants of the Romanov dynasty who believed that removing Paul was necessary to save both the empire and the royal family itself. The assassination of Paul on March 23, 1801, was carried out with a brutality that shocked even those who had planned it. The conspirators had intended to force his abdication, but when Paul refused to sign the document renouncing his throne, the confrontation escalated into violence that left the Tsar dead from strangulation and blunt force trauma. The murder of Paul I marked a watershed moment in Romanov history. For the first time since the dynasty had come to power, a reigning Tsar had been killed not by foreign enemies or popular uprising, but by his own nobles and military officers. The precedent was terrifying in its implications. If the empire's most elite supporters could justify regicide when they disapproved of a ruler's policies, what protection did any future Tsar have against similar treatment? The man who inherited this blood-stained throne was Alexander I, Paul's 23-year-old son who had been informed of the conspiracy against his father but had done nothing to prevent it. Alexander's complicity in his father's murder would haunt him for the rest of his reign, creating a psychological burden that influenced every major decision he made as emperor. But Alexander also inherited advantages that his father had squandered. The nobility that had grown to hate Paul welcomed his son as a liberator from tyranny. The Guards regiments that had felt dishonoured under Paul's arbitrary rule embraced Alexander as a return to the enlightened governance they remembered from Catherine's reign. The European powers that had been alienated by Paul's erratic diplomacy saw Alexander's accession as an opportunity to rebuild the alliances that had been damaged by his predecessor's policies. Most importantly, Alexander inherited an empire that was still fundamentally strong despite the chaos of Paul's reign. The territorial gains that Catherine had won were intact. The administrative system that she had created was still functioning despite Paul's interference. The military that had made Russia a great power retained its basic competence and morale, despite the disruptions of the previous 5 years. Alexander's challenge was to restore confidence in the Romanov dynasty while addressing the underlying problems that had made his father's reign so catastrophic. He needed to prove that the monarchy could be both strong and rational, both autocratic and enlightened. He needed to demonstrate that Russian power could be exercised effectively without descending into the paranoia and brutality that had characterized Paul's rule. The test of these abilities came sooner than anyone expected. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power in France had created a new kind of threat to the European balance of power. The French emperor's ambitions weren't limited to traditional territorial conquest. He sought to restructure the entire European political system according to principles that challenged the legitimacy of hereditary monarchy itself. For Alexander, the conflict with Napoleon became more than just war, another between great powers. It became a struggle for the survival of everything the Romanov dynasty represented. If Napoleon succeeded in his plans to remake Europe, there might be no place left for traditional monarchies like Russia. If he failed, Russia would emerge as one of the dominant powers in the post-Napoleonic order. The wars against Napoleon would test every aspect of Russian strength that had been built up over the previous century. Military competence, administrative efficiency, financial resources, popular loyalty, diplomatic skill, and imperial leadership would all be pushed to their limits in a conflict that would determine whether the Romanov Empire would survive and prosper or collapse under the pressure of revolutionary change. The first phase of this struggle went badly for Russia. Napoleon's military genius proved superior to traditional Russian tactics at battles like Austerlitz in 1805, where the combined armies of Russia and Austria were decisively defeated by French forces that seemed to represent a new kind of warfare. The emperor, who had styled himself as the heir to Catherine the Great, found himself forced to accept humiliating peace terms that reduced Russia's influence in European affairs. But Alexander learned from these early defeats in ways that his father never could have. Instead of responding to military setbacks with paranoid fury, he used them as opportunities to reform Russian institutions and strategy. He recruited talented generals like Michael Barclay de Tolly and Mikhail Kutuzov, who understood how to adapt Russian strengths to meet the Napoleonic challenge. He reformed the army's organization and tactics to take advantage of Russia's superior numbers and familiarity with harsh winter conditions. Most importantly, Alexander recognized that defeating Napoleon would require more than just military success. It would require the mobilization of Russian society on a scale that had never been attempted before. The invasion would have to be turned into a patriotic war that engaged not just the professional army, but the entire Russian population in resistance against foreign domination. When Napoleon's Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River in June 1812, it consisted of over 600,000 men drawn from across the French Empire and its satellite states. It was the largest military force that had ever been assembled for a single campaign, equipped with the best weapons and tactics that European military science could provide. The Russian response was everything that Napoleon had not expected. Instead of meeting the French army in pitched battle where superior French tactics might have decided the outcome, Russian forces retreated deep into their own territory, drawing the invaders away from their supply lines and into the vast spaces where Russian advantages of numbers and terrain could be most effectively employed. The strategy worked brilliantly. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September 1812, his army had been reduced by disease, desertion, and constant skirmishing to less than half its original strength. The capital that he captured was largely abandoned by its population and soon consumed by fires that destroyed most of the supplies he had hoped to use for winter quarters. The French emperor's situation became impossible when Alexander refused to negotiate the peace settlement that Napoleon had expected would follow the capture of Moscow. Instead of treating the occupation of his capital as a decisive defeat, Alexander presented it as simply another phase in a longer struggle that would continue until foreign forces were completely expelled from Russian soil. The retreat from Moscow became one of the most devastating military disasters in European history. Napoleon's army, weakened by months of campaigning and unprepared for the severity of the Russian winter, disintegrated during its withdrawal across the frozen landscape. Fewer than 30,000 men from the original Grande Armée successfully crossed back into Poland as organized military units. The victory over Napoleon transformed Alexander from a relatively minor European monarch into one of the most influential leaders of his generation. Russian armies didn't just drive the French from their own territory. They pursued Napoleon across Central Europe, participating in the campaigns that eventually led to his abdication and exile to Elba. Alexander's personal role in the coalition that defeated Napoleon elevated him to a position of moral authority that transcended mere military success. He became known as the liberator of Europe, the monarch who had saved the continent from revolutionary tyranny. His entrance into Paris in March 1814 marked not just a Russian victory, but a vindication of the entire monarchical system that Napoleon had challenged. The Congress of Vienna that followed Napoleon's defeat gave Alexander the opportunity to reshape the European political order according to his own vision of how international relations should be conducted. The Holy Alliance that he proposed with Austria and Prussia was intended to create a new kind of diplomacy based on Christian principles and mutual respect among legitimate monarchs. But Alexander's triumph contained the seeds of future problems for the Romanov dynasty. The victory over Napoleon had been achieved through the mobilization of Russian patriotic sentiment on an unprecedented scale. For the first time in the empire's history, ordinary subjects had been called upon to see themselves as Russians first, and subjects of the Tsar second. The war had created a sense of national identity that existed independently of loyalty to the ruling dynasty. This new Russian nationalism was powerfully reinforced by the army officers who had campaigned across Europe and seen how other societies were organized. These men returned to Russia with first-hand knowledge of constitutional governments, civil liberties, and social systems that were less rigid than the autocracy and serfdom that defined Russian life. The Decembrist movement that emerged among these officers represented something new in Russian politics. Previous challenges to Tsarist authority had come from foreign enemies, popular uprisings, or palace conspiracies motivated by personal ambition. The Decembrists were educated, patriotic Russians who opposed specific aspects of the imperial system, not out of disloyalty to Russia, but out of love for their country and desire to see it achieve its full potential. Alexander's response to growing liberal sentiment among the educated classes revealed the fundamental contradictions that would plague the dynasty for the rest of its existence. He personally sympathized with many Decembrist ideals and even considered implementing constitutional reforms that would have limited autocratic power. But he also recognized that rapid political change might destabilize the social system that sustained Russian power and prosperity. The result was a reign characterized by constant tension between reform and reaction, between Alexander's enlightened ideals and his practical recognition of the constraints that limited his freedom of action. He abolished serfdom in the Baltic provinces, but left it intact in the rest of the empire. He established universities and promoted education while maintaining censorship and political surveillance. He encouraged intellectual discussion while suppressing any organized opposition to government policies. This contradictory approach satisfied neither liberals who wanted systematic reform, nor conservatives who feared any change in traditional arrangements. By the time of Alexander's death in 1825, Russian society was more polarized than it had been since the religious schisms of the 17th century. The succession crisis that followed Alexander's death brought these tensions to a head in the most dramatic way possible. The confusion over whether Alexander's brother Constantine or his other brother Nicholas would inherit the throne created exactly the kind of political vacuum that the Decembrists had been waiting for. On December 14th, 1825, officers of several guards regiments refused to take the oath of loyalty to Nicholas I, and instead assembled in Senate Square to demand constitutional government. The Decembrist revolt represented the first organised attempt by Russian nobles to limit autocratic power through revolutionary action rather than palace conspiracy. Nicholas I's response to the revolt established the pattern that would define his reign and set the stage for the final crisis of the Romanov dynasty. He crushed the rebellion with military force, executed its leaders, and implemented a system of political repression more systematic than anything Russia had experienced since the reign of Ivan the Terrible. But the victory over the Decembrists came at an enormous cost. Nicholas had demonstrated that the monarchy would use unlimited force to preserve its authority, but he had also revealed the depth of opposition that autocracy faced among the most educated and patriotic segments of Russian society. The executions and exiles that followed the revolt created martyrs for the liberal cause and convinced many Russians that peaceful reform was impossible under the existing system. The reign of Nicholas I from 1825 to 1855 marked the beginning of the end for the Romanov dynasty, though few recognized the signs at the time. The emperor, who styled himself as the defender of legitimacy and order throughout Europe, presided over an empire that was gradually falling behind its European competitors in almost every measure of national strength and development. The Industrial Revolution that was transforming Western Europe barely touched Russia during Nicholas's reign. The educational and administrative reforms that were modernizing other European states were blocked by Nicholas's determination to preserve traditional arrangements. The constitutional developments that were giving other European populations a voice in their governance were suppressed in Russia with increasing severity. Most ominously, the military system that had defeated Napoleon was becoming obsolete, as other European armies adopted new technologies and tactics. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 exposed the weaknesses that had developed in Russian institutions during 3 decades of reactionary rule. The defeat in the Crimea was more than just a military setback. It was a revelation that the Russian Empire could no longer compete effectively with the modernized states of Western Europe. The country that had dominated European politics after the Napoleonic Wars had fallen so far behind its competitors that it could not defend its own territory against a coalition of enemies who were technologically and organizationally superior. Nicholas I's death in 1855, possibly by suicide in despair over Russia's humiliating defeats, marked the end of the era when the Romanov dynasty could maintain its authority through force and tradition alone. The empire that his son Alexander II inherited was in desperate need of fundamental reform, but such reform would require changes that might undermine the very foundations of autocratic power. The challenge facing the new Tsar was unprecedented in Romanov history. How do you modernize an empire without destroying the political system that holds it together? How do you compete with constitutional states while maintaining absolute monarchy? How do you satisfy demands for social change while preserving the privileges of the classes that support your rule? Alexander II's attempts to answer these questions would define the final phase of Romanov history. A half-century struggle between the forces of reform and reaction that would ultimately end in revolution and the complete destruction of the dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 300 years. The Tsar who inherited this impossible task was a man shaped by the contradictions of his father's reign. Alexander II had been educated by liberal tutors who had filled his mind with ideas about progress and reform, but he had also witnessed the brutal suppression of the Decembrist revolt and learned to fear the consequences of political change. He understood that Russia needed to modernize, but he also knew that modernization might unleash forces that no autocrat could control. The decision that would define his reign came within 2 years of his accession to the throne. On March 3, 1861, Alexander II signed the Emancipation Edict that freed over 20 million serfs from bondage to their noble landlords. The proclamation was read in churches across the empire to peasants who could barely believe that their centuries of enslavement had finally ended. The abolition of serfdom was the most dramatic social change in Russian history since the time of troubles. It affected every aspect of Russian life, from agriculture and industry to law and administration. It created new opportunities for millions of former serfs, while simultaneously threatening the economic foundation of the nobility that had supported the dynasty for generations. But emancipation was just the beginning of Alexander's reform program. Legal reform created an independent judiciary and trial by jury for the first time in Russian history. Military reform modernized the army and reduced the term of service that had made military conscription a form of social death. Educational reform expanded universities and created new opportunities for social mobility based on merit rather than birth. The cumulative effect of these changes was to begin the transformation of Russia from a traditional autocracy into something resembling a modern state. But transformation brought new problems that proved even more difficult to solve than the old ones. Freed serfs who had expected land ownership found themselves burdened with redemption payments that kept them in poverty. Nobles who had lost their serf labour struggled to maintain their estates and their traditional way of life. Educated Russians who had gained new rights and opportunities demanded still more fundamental changes in how their country was governed. Most dangerously, the reforms created expectations that they would lead to still greater changes. If serfdom could be abolished, why not autocracy itself? If the legal system could be modernized, why not the political system as well? If Russians could be trusted with jury service, why couldn't they be trusted with representative government? Alexander II found himself caught between conservatives who thought he had already changed too much and liberals who thought he hadn't changed enough. Every reform that he implemented created demands for additional reforms. Every attempt to limit the pace of change created opposition from those who wanted faster progress. The revolutionary movement that emerged during Alexander's reign was unlike anything Russia had experienced before. Previous opposition to Tsarist authority had been motivated by specific grievances or personal ambitions. The new revolutionaries were driven by ideological convictions that rejected the entire system of autocratic rule and called for its complete replacement with socialist or anarchist alternatives. These weren't disgruntled nobles seeking to limit imperial power or peasants rising against local oppression. These were educated Russians who had concluded that the Romanov system was incapable of reform and had to be destroyed through revolutionary violence. Their campaigns of assassination and terrorism created a climate of fear that made normal political life increasingly impossible. The irony was devastating. Alexander II, who had done more to modernize Russia than any Tsar since Peter the Great, became the target of revolutionary groups that saw reform as inadequate and demanded revolution instead. The emperor, who had freed the serfs and modernized the legal system, was murdered by terrorists who believed that gradual change was a betrayal of their radical ideals. Alexander's assassination on March 13, 1881, marked the beginning of the final crisis that would ultimately destroy the Romanov dynasty. The bomb that killed the Tsar Liberator didn't just end one man's life. It ended the possibility of peaceful evolution toward a more modern and representative form of government in Russia. The man who inherited Alexander's blood-stained throne was Alexander III, a conservative who had opposed most of his father's reforms and was determined to restore the traditional autocracy that had been weakened by decades of change. His reign from 1881 to 1894 marked a systematic attempt to reverse the modernization process and return Russia to the rigid authoritarianism of Nicholas I's era. But the Russia that Alexander III tried to govern was no longer the same country that his grandfather had ruled with such apparent success. The social changes unleashed by the Great Reforms could not be reversed by administrative decree. The economic forces that were transforming European society were beginning to affect Russia despite government attempts to control them. The revolutionary movements that had assassinated his father continued to grow despite intensified police repression. Most importantly, the international environment that had allowed previous czars to ignore domestic pressures was disappearing. The alliance system that was taking shape in Europe required Russia to compete militarily and economically with powers that were becoming increasingly superior in industrial capacity and technological innovation. When Alexander III died in 1894, he left behind an empire that appeared stable and prosperous, but was actually approaching a crisis that would test every assumption about how Russia should be governed. His son Nicholas II would inherit not just a throne, but an impossible set of contradictions that no amount of good intentions or political skill would be able to resolve. The stage was set for the final act of the Romanov drama. The dynasty that had risen from obscurity to rule the largest empire in human history was about to face challenges that would prove beyond its capacity to meet. The golden age that had reached its peak under Catherine the Great was giving way to a silver age that would soon tarnish into something far darker. The young man who became Nicholas II in 1894 had no way of knowing that he would be the last Romanov to sit on the throne his ancestors had occupied for nearly 3 centuries. He could not have imagined that the empire he inherited would disappear within his lifetime, swept away by forces that had been building pressure for generations, but were only now approaching the breaking point. The final chapter of Romanov history was about to begin, and it would be written in blood and revolution rather than the glory and expansion that had marked the dynasty's earlier centuries. The shadows that had always lurked beneath the surface of autocratic rule were about to engulf the throne room itself, bringing to an end one of the most remarkable stories in the annals of human power. The man who inherited the Romanov throne in 1894 was 26 years old, deeply religious and utterly unprepared for the magnitude of the challenges that awaited him. Nicholas II had spent his youth expecting to serve as a supporting figure in his father's long reign, learning statecraft gradually over decades of apprenticeship. Instead, Alexander III's unexpected death from kidney disease thrust him into absolute power over 126 million subjects at a moment when the empire was approaching the most dangerous crossroads in its 300-year history. Nicholas's first instinct was to continue his father's policies of conservative reaction and resistance to change. At his coronation ceremony in 1896, he made it clear that he intended to maintain the principle of unlimited autocracy that had defined Romanov rule since the time of troubles. When representatives from local governments presented him with addresses, hoping for expanded participation in governance, his response was dismissive and final. He called such hopes senseless dreams, and declared his intention to maintain autocracy as firmly and steadfastly as his father had done. But the Russia that Nicholas inherited was no longer a country where autocracy could be maintained through tradition and force alone. The economic changes that had been building since the Great Reforms were accelerating at a pace that made previous social transformations seem glacial by comparison. Factory towns were sprouting across the landscape as Russian entrepreneurs, often with foreign investment, built the industrial infrastructure that the empire desperately needed to compete with Western Europe. This industrialization brought with it a new social class that had barely existed during previous reigns. Industrial workers concentrated in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow lived in conditions that made the poverty of rural serfs seem almost comfortable by comparison. They worked 12 to 14-hour days in factories where safety regulations were virtually non-existent. They lived in overcrowded tenements where entire families occupied single rooms. They earned wages that barely covered the cost of survival while watching their employers accumulate unprecedented wealth. These workers had no stake in the existing political system and no reason to feel loyalty toward a government that seemed to care nothing for their welfare. Unlike the peasants who had traditionally formed the backbone of Russian society, industrial workers were literate, concentrated in large numbers, and exposed to revolutionary ideas through underground newspapers and clandestine political organizations. The revolutionary movements that had emerged during Alexander II's reign were evolving into something far more sophisticated and dangerous than the terrorism that had characterized earlier opposition to Tsarist rule. The Social Democratic Party, founded in 1898, brought Marxist ideas to Russian conditions and began organizing systematic opposition to autocracy among the growing industrial working class. Even more ominously, the Social Revolutionary Party was developing new methods of peasant organization that threatened to mobilize the rural population that had always been the monarchy's most reliable source of support. The SRS, as they became known, combined traditional Russian populist ideals with modern organizational techniques to create a revolutionary unite, both movement that could potentially urban workers and rural peasants against the existing order. Nicholas's response to these mounting pressures revealed would define his reign. He was both and fatal the strong weaknesses that genuinely committed to the welfare of his subjects and sincerely believed that autocratic rule was the best way to protect their interests. He spent hours each day reading reports from across the empire, trying to understand the problems that faced ordinary Russians and to find solutions that would improve their lives without undermining the stability of the system. But Nicholas also possessed a rigidity of mind that made it almost impossible for him to adapt his beliefs to changing circumstances. He had been raised to see autocracy not just as a political system, but as a sacred trust handed down from God through generations of his ancestors. To compromise that trust by accepting constitutional limitations on his power would be not just political surrender, but spiritual betrayal of everything the Romanov dynasty represented. This fundamental inflexibility became apparent in Nicholas's handling of the first major crisis of his reign. In 1898, students at universities across Russia began organizing protests against government restrictions on academic freedom and political expression. What started as relatively minor demonstrations escalated into a nationwide movement that included not just students, but professors, lawyers, doctors, and other members of the educated middle class. The liberal opposition that emerged from these protests was fundamentally different from the revolutionary movements that sought to overthrow the monarchy entirely. These were moderate Russians who wanted to work within the existing system to achieve gradual reform. They weren't calling for the abolition of the monarchy, just for constitutional limits on autocratic power that would give educated Russians a voice in how their country was governed. Nicholas could have used this moderate opposition as an ally against more radical revolutionary movements. By granting limited constitutional concessions to liberals, he could have isolated extremists and created a stable middle ground that might have preserved monarchical authority while satisfying demands for political participation. Instead, his response was to increase repression against all forms of political opposition, making no distinction between moderate liberals who wanted reform and radical revolutionaries who wanted revolution. University professors who had signed petitions calling for academic freedom found themselves dismissed from their positions. Lawyers who had defended political prisoners discovered that their own licenses to practice were being revoked. Doctors who had treated wounded demonstrators were subjected to police surveillance and harassment. This indiscriminate repression had exactly the opposite effect of what Nicholas intended. Instead of discouraging opposition to his government, it convinced many moderate Russians that peaceful reform was impossible under the existing system. Liberals who had initially hoped to work with the monarchy began to conclude that autocracy itself was the obstacle to progress. The radicalization of Russian society accelerated dramatically after 1900, when economic depression combined with military humiliation to create a perfect storm of discontent. The industrial boom of the 1890s collapsed into recession hundreds, throwing thousands of workers into unemployment, while simultaneously reducing government revenues needed to fund military modernization and administrative reform. The military disaster that exposed Russia's weakness came not from a traditional European enemy, but from an Asian power that most Russians had dismissed as insignificant. Japan's surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in February 1904 launched a war that would demonstrate just how far the Russian Empire had fallen behind the modern world in military technology and organizational efficiency. The Russo-Japanese War was a catastrophe on every level. Russian armies, equipped with weapons and led with Obsold by generals who still thought in terms of 19th century tactics, were repeatedly defeated by Japanese forces that had thoroughly modernized their military along Western lines. The Baltic Fleet, sent on an epic journey around the world to relieve the besieged fortress of Port Arthur, was annihilated by the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905. More than just military defeats, these disasters revealed the institutional rot that had spread throughout the Russian government during decades of conservative reaction. Corruption in the military procurement system had left Russian soldiers with defective rifles and inadequate supplies. Incompetence in the railway administration had made it impossible to move reinforcements efficiently across the vast distances of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Bureaucratic infighting had prevented effective coordination between different branches of the armed forces. The news of each military defeat sent shockwaves through Russian society and convinced growing numbers of people that fundamental change was necessary to prevent the complete collapse of the empire. If Russia could not defend itself against Japan, how could it hope to compete with the great powers of Europe? If the government could not organize an effective war effort against a smaller Asian nation, how could it be trusted to address the massive domestic problems that were tearing the country apart? The revolution that erupted in 1905 began not with the organized opposition movements that Nicholas had been fighting for years, but with a spontaneous demonstration by workers who still believed that their problems could be solved through appeal to the Tsar's mercy and justice. Father Gapon, an Orthodox priest who had been organising workers in St. Petersburg, led a peaceful procession to the Winter Palace on January 9th to present a petition asking Nicholas to address their grievances. The petition that the workers carried was remarkably moderate in its demands. They asked for an 8-hour workday, basic safety regulations in factories, and representation in government decision-making that affected their lives. They addressed Nicholas as their little father and expressed confidence that he would help them once he understood their suffering. The response they received shattered whatever remained of the traditional bond between the Tsar and his people. Guards regiments opened fire on the unarmed demonstrators, killing hundreds of workers whose only crime had been believing that their emperor cared about their welfare. Bloody Sunday, as the massacre became known, destroyed the myth of the benevolent autocrat who protected his people from the exploitation of nobles and bureaucrats. The revolution that followed was unlike anything Russia had experienced since the time of Troubles. Strikes spread across the empire as workers who had lost faith in the Tsar's protection demanded fundamental changes in how they were treated. Peasant uprisings erupted in rural areas where land hunger had been building for decades since emancipation. Military mutinies, mostly on Fam, the battleship Potemkin, demonstrated that even the armed forces could no longer be counted on to support the existing order without question. Most dangerously for the dynasty, the liberal opposition that Nicholas had alienated through years of repression now joined forces with revolutionary movements in demanding an end to unlimited autocracy. Professional associations, Zemstvo representatives, and even some nobles called for the establishment of a constitutional monarchy that would limit imperial power and give Russian society a voice in its own governance. Nicholas's initial response was characteristically inflexible. He blamed the revolution on foreign agitators and revolutionary troublemakers, refusing to acknowledge that the uprising represented genuine grievances from loyal Russians who had been driven to desperation by government indifference to their suffering. He authorized military commanders to use unlimited force in suppressing demonstrations and declared martial law in regions where opposition was strongest. But by October 1905, it became clear that force alone would not be sufficient to restore order. A general strike had paralyzed the entire empire, shutting down factories, railways, and government offices. Even the capital itself was without electricity or public transportation as workers demonstrated their power to bring the machinery of state to a complete halt. Faced with the choice between fundamental concessions and the possible collapse of his government entirely, Nicholas finally agreed to the constitutional reforms that he had resisted for over a decade. The October Manifesto promised civil liberties, an elected parliament with real legislative powers, and constitutional limits on autocratic authority that would transform Russia into a modern constitutional monarchy. The concessions contained in the October Manifesto were everything that moderate liberals had been demanding since the beginning of Nicholas's reign. If they had been granted earlier, they might have prevented the revolution entirely and created the stable middle ground that could have preserved monarchical authority while satisfying demands for political participation. But by 1905, the forces that Nicholas's inflexibility had unleashed were no longer satisfied with constitutional monarchy. Revolutionary parties that had grown stronger during years of government repression saw the October Manifesto not as a satisfactory solution to Russia's problems, but as evidence that the monarchy was weakening and could be pushed toward complete collapse. The Moscow uprising in December 1905 demonstrated both the strength of revolutionary opposition and the fundamental weakness of Nicholas's position. When workers in Moscow attempted to establish a revolutionary government, Nicholas had to use artillery to bombard working-class neighborhoods in his own capital to restore government control. The emperor, who had promised constitutional rule, was forced to wage war against his own subjects to maintain his authority. The suppression of the Moscow uprising marked the beginning of a period that historians would call the Stolypin reaction, named after the prime minister who implemented a systematic campaign of repression designed to destroy revolutionary organizations and restore government authority. Thousands of revolutionaries were executed or exiled to Siberia. Revolutionary parties were driven underground where they continued to operate but could no longer mount the kind of mass demonstrations that had characterized the 1905 revolution. But the Stolypin system, successful as it was in restoring order, could not address the fundamental problems that had caused the revolution in the first place. The constitutional monarchy that Nicholas had promised was systematically undermined by electoral that gave disproportionate power to Law's conservative voters rural while limiting the influence of urban workers and liberal professionals. The Duma, or parliament, that was supposed to give Russians a voice in their government was repeatedly dissolved when it attempted to address issues like land reform or expansion of civil liberties. The civil liberties promised in the October Manifesto were gradually eroded by emergency regulations that gave provincial governors almost unlimited power to suppress political opposition. Most importantly, the economic and social changes that were transforming Russian society continued to accelerate regardless of government attempts to control them. Industrial development, which had briefly slowed during the revolution, resumed at an even faster pace as foreign investors returned and domestic entrepreneurs expanded their operations. The working class that had played such a crucial role in the 1905 revolution continued to grow in size and political consciousness. By 1914, Russia appeared to have achieved the stability that had eluded it during the previous decade. The revolutionary movements had been crushed or driven underground. The economy was growing rapidly, with industrial production increasing at rates that rivaled Germany and the United States. Agricultural productivity was improving as Stolypin's land reforms allowed more efficient farmers to consolidate holdings that had been fragmented since emancipation. But this apparent stability was built on foundations that remained fundamentally weak. The constitutional monarchy that existed on paper had never been accepted in practice by either Nicholas or his subjects. The Tsar continued to see constitutional limits on his authority as temporary concessions that could be withdrawn when circumstances permitted. Opposition groups continued to see the existing system as illegitimate and looked forward to opportunities to resume their struggle for more fundamental change. The opportunity came in the form of a war that nobody wanted, but that seemed impossible to avoid once the complex alliance system of early 20th century Europe began to activate. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 triggered a series of military mobilizations that drew Russia into a conflict for which it was militarily, economically, and politically unprepared. Nicholas's decision to support Serbia against Austria-Hungary was driven by the same considerations that had influenced Russian foreign policy since the time of Catherine the Great. Russia could not allow the Balkans to be dominated by hostile powers without risking its own security and influence in southeastern Europe. The Orthodox Slavs of the region looked to Russia for protection against Catholic Austria and Muslim Turkey. But the war that began as a limited conflict over Balkan influence rapidly escalated into a global struggle that would test every aspect of national strength and endurance. The German Empire that Russia faced in 1914 was not the Prussia that had been defeated by Alexander I a century earlier. This was a modern industrial state with the most advanced military technology in the world and an economy that could sustain prolonged warfare far better than Russia's still largely agricultural system. The initial campaigns of World War I revealed that the military reforms implemented since the Russo-Japanese War had been insufficient to bring Russian capabilities up to European standards. Russian armies were larger than those of their enemies, but they lacked the artillery, machine guns, and communications equipment necessary for modern warfare. Russian generals were brave and experienced, but they had not adapted their tactics to account for the deadly effectiveness of defensive positions equipped with rapid-fire weapons. Most critically, the Russian economy was incapable of supporting the kind of total war that the conflict quickly became. The industrial capacity that had seemed so impressive during peacetime proved inadequate when every factory had to be converted to military production. The transportation system that had struggled to supply the Far Eastern War against Japan completely broke down under the strain of moving millions of soldiers and vast quantities of supplies to multiple fronts. The human cost of Russia's military efforts was staggering even by the brutal standards of World War I. In the first year of fighting alone, Russian casualties exceeded 1 million dead, wounded, and missing. Entire army corps were destroyed in battles where superior German firepower made Russian numerical advantages irrelevant. The flower of Russian youth died in attacks against positions that could not be taken and should never have been attempted. But the military disasters were only the beginning of the crisis that would ultimately destroy the Romanov dynasty. The war effort required economic mobilization on a scale that the Russian government had never attempted and proved incapable of organizing effectively. Food shortages appeared in major cities as agricultural production declined, and transportation bottlenecks prevented the movement of supplies from rural areas to urban centers. Industrial production, instead of increasing to meet military needs, actually declined as factories lost workers to military conscription and raw materials to the chaos of wartime logistics. The currency collapsed as the government printed money to finance military expenditures that far exceeded its ability to raise revenue through taxation. By 1916, inflation was destroying the savings of middle-class Russians while making it impossible for workers to afford basic necessities even when they were available. The political consequences of military and economic failure were even more devastating than the immediate suffering they caused. Nicholas had staked his legitimacy as autocrat on his ability to lead Russia to victory against its enemies. When that victory proved impossible to achieve, his subjects began to question not just his competence as a war leader, but his right to rule at all. The crisis of confidence in the monarchy was deepened by scandals surrounding the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant and self-proclaimed holy man who had gained access to the imperial family through his apparent ability to treat the hemophilia that the life of threatened Tsarevich Alexis. Rasputin's presence at court became a symbol of everything that was wrong with autocratic rule: the arbitrary exercise of power, the influence of unqualified advisors, and the isolation of the imperial family from the realities of Russian life. When Rasputin was murdered by a group of nobles in December 1916, the act was widely seen not as regicide but as patriotic service to the nation. The fact that members of the highest aristocracy felt compelled to take such drastic action demonstrated how completely the monarchy had lost the confidence of even its traditional supporters. By the beginning of 1917, the Romanov dynasty that had survived the time of troubles, the reign of Peter the Great, the Napoleonic invasion, the Crimean War, and the Revolution of 1905 was facing a crisis that would prove beyond its capacity to survive. The empire that had been built over 3 centuries through conquest, reform, and adaptation was about to collapse under pressures that no amount of tradition, force, or good intentions could overcome. The end, when it came, would be swift and final. The dynasty that had seemed so permanent, so deeply rooted in Russian soil and Russian consciousness, would disappear in a matter of days, swept away by forces that had been building for generations but were only now reaching the breaking point. The final act of the Romanov drama was about to begin, and it would be written not in the golden ink of imperial proclamations, but in the blood of revolution and civil war. The shadows that had always lurked beneath the glittering surface of autocratic rule were about to consume everything that 300 years of Romanov ambition had created. The revolution that would destroy the dynasty was approaching with the inexorability of an avalanche. All that remained was to see whether anything would survive the catastrophe that was about to engulf the throne, the empire, and the family that had ruled Russia since the dark days when foreign armies occupied Moscow and the very survival of the Russian state hung in the balance. The wheel of history was about to complete another full rotation, bringing Russia back to the chaos and uncertainty from which the Romanovs had emerged in 1613. But this time there would be no miraculous rescue, no assembly of the land to choose a new dynasty, no second chance for the family whose name had become synonymous with Russian power and Russian glory. The final winter of Romanov rule was beginning, and it would prove to be the longest and darkest winter in the dynasty's 300-year history. The breadlines that snaked through the streets of Petrograd in February 1917 told the story of an empire in its death throes. Women who had once lived comfortable middle-class lives now stood for hours in the bitter cold, hoping to buy a loaf of black bread that cost more than their husbands had earned in a week just 2 years earlier. Workers who had built the factories that were supposed to make Russia a modern industrial power now watched those same factories close for lack of fuel, raw materials, and basic organisation. But it wasn't just hunger that drove people into the streets on February 23, 1917. It was the crushing realisation that the government they had trusted to protect them, to lead them, to justify their sacrifices, had failed them so completely that continuing to endure seemed pointless. The International Women's Day demonstration that began as a protest against food shortages quickly transformed into something far more dangerous for the dynasty. It became a rejection of everything the Romanov system represented. Nicholas II was 300 miles away from his capital when the revolution began, commanding troops at the front who were themselves on the verge of mutiny. The irony was devastating. The Tsar who had insisted on maintaining absolute power was absent when that power was challenged in its most direct form. The Emperor, who had refused to delegate authority to competent ministers, was not present when his government collapsed under pressures that competent leadership might have managed. The reports that reached Nicholas at his military headquarters painted a picture of chaos that he seemed incapable of comprehending. His ministers telegrammed that crowds were gathering in the streets, but Nicholas had seen crowds before during the 1905 revolution, and they had been dispersed with sufficient force. His military commanders reported that some units were refusing orders, but Nicholas had dealt with military discipline problems throughout the war, and they had always been resolved through changes in personnel and stricter enforcement of regulations. What Nicholas failed to understand was that this time was different. The crowds that filled the streets of Petrograd weren't just angry about specific grievances that could be addressed through policy changes or administrative reforms. They had lost faith in the entire system of government that he represented. The soldiers who were refusing orders weren't just responding to poor conditions or incompetent leadership. They had concluded that the war itself was a catastrophic mistake that was destroying Russia for no achievable purpose. Most crucially, the political and social elite who had traditionally supported the monarchy through every previous crisis were now actively working for Nicholas's removal. Liberal politicians in the Duma saw the revolution as an opportunity to establish the constitutional government they had been denied for over a decade. Military commanders who had watched their armies destroyed by incompetent leadership concluded that Russia could only be saved by new leadership. Even Grand Dukes from Nicholas's own family believed that abdication was necessary to preserve what remained of the Romanov legacy. The speed with which the supposedly mighty Russian Empire collapsed revealed just how hollow its foundations had become. Within 5 days of the first demonstrations, the capital was completely under revolutionary control. Police stations had been burned, government offices occupied, and prisons opened to release political prisoners who immediately joined the uprising. The Cossack units that had traditionally been the monarchy's most reliable supporters either joined the revolution or remained neutral, unwilling to fire on crowds that included their own wives and children. When Nicholas finally attempted to return to Petrograd to restore order, he discovered that even the railway workers had joined the revolution. His imperial train was stopped at Pskov, where he found himself effectively a prisoner of his own military commanders. General Alexeyev, the chief of staff who had served the dynasty faithfully for decades, informed the Tsar that continuing resistance would only lead to civil war and the complete destruction of Russia as a functioning state. The abdication document that Nicholas signed on March 2nd, 1917, was more than just a personal surrender. It was the end of a political system that had defined Russian civilization for over 3 centuries. With a few strokes of his pen, Nicholas dissolved not just his own authority, but the entire structure of autocratic rule that had been built by generations of his ancestors. The decision to abdicate in favour of his brother Michael rather than his son Alexis revealed the depth of Nicholas's understanding of what was happening to his dynasty. He knew that Alexis's haemophilia would make him a weak ruler who could be easily manipulated by political factions. But he also knew that the revolution had made the survival of any Romanov ruler extremely unlikely. By abdicating in favour of Michael, who refused the throne unless it was offered by a constituent assembly, Nicholas effectively ensured that the dynasty would end with him. The provisional government that emerged from the February Revolution inherited an impossible situation. They had to continue fighting a war that had already destroyed the previous government while simultaneously implementing the democratic reforms that had been promised to justify the revolution. They had to restore order to a country where authority had completely collapsed while maintaining the freedom that had made the revolution possible in the first place. But the fundamental problem facing the provisional government wasn't just political or military. It was the existence of a rival source of power that had emerged simultaneously with the revolution itself. The Petrograd Soviet, representing workers and soldiers who had actually carried out the uprising, claimed authority over the very groups whose support any government needed to survive. This dual power situation made effective governance virtually impossible. The provisional government could issue orders, but the Soviet controlled whether those orders would be obeyed. The ministers could declare policies, but the workers and soldiers followed the Soviets' directives when they conflicted with government decisions. Russia had traded the absolute power of one man for the absolute paralysis of 2 competing authorities. The Bolsheviks, who had played a relatively minor role in the February Revolution, understood this situation better than any other political faction. While liberals and moderate socialists debated constitutional arrangements and democratic procedures, Lenin and his followers focused on the one question that really mattered: who actually controlled the soldiers, the workers, and the peasants who would determine Russia's future. Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917 marked the beginning of the final phase in the destruction of everything the Romanov dynasty had created. His April theses called for the immediate transformation of the democratic revolution into a socialist one, the withdrawal of Russia from the war regardless of consequences, and the transfer of all power to the Soviets that represented the revolutionary masses. The program seemed impossibly radical to most Russian politicians in the spring of 1917. Even many Bolsheviks thought Lenin had lost touch with Russian realities during his years of exile. But Lenin understood something that his more moderate opponents missed. The February Revolution had unleashed forces that could not be controlled through parliamentary democracy or constitutional government. Either the revolution would continue until it had completely transformed Russian society, or it would be crushed by counter-revolutionary forces that would restore some form of authoritarian rule. The choice facing Russia wasn't between democracy and autocracy. It was between radical revolution and violent reaction. And in that struggle, the moderate liberals and democratic socialists who had initially benefited from the fall of the Tsar would find themselves caught between forces that had no interest in the constitutional compromises they hoped to achieve. The provisional government's fatal mistake was continuing Russia's participation in World War I. Every other decision they made, every reform they implemented, every democratic procedure they established was undermined by their inability to end the war that had destroyed the previous government and was continuing to destroy the country itself. By summer 1917, entire Russian army units were abandoning their positions and walking home. The offensive launched by General Brusilov in June collapsed within days as soldiers refused to attack and officers were murdered by their own men. The discipline that had held the Russian military together for over 2 centuries disintegrated as quickly as the political system it had been created to serve. The economic situation was even worse than the military collapse. Industrial production had fallen to less than half of pre-war levels as factories shut down for lack of fuel and raw materials. Agricultural output declined as peasants left their fields to join the revolution or were conscripted into armies that no longer existed as functional military units. The currency became virtually worthless as the government printed money to pay for a war effort that was consuming resources faster than the entire Russian economy could produce them. But the final blow to any hope of moderate democratic government came from the very social groups that the February Revolution had supposedly liberated. Peasants who had been promised land reform began seizing estates immediately, rather than waiting for legislative action. Workers who had been granted the right to organise began taking control of factories and establishing their own management systems. Soldiers who had been told they were fighting for democracy began deserting en masse to return to their villages and participate in the redistribution of land. The revolution was consuming itself, destroying the very institutions that democratic politicians hoped to use to channel popular demands into legal reforms. By October 1917, the provisional government existed mainly on paper, while real power had passed to whoever could command the loyalty of armed groups willing to use violence to achieve their goals. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October was less a revolution than a recognition of facts that had already been established by 6 months of governmental collapse. Lenin's party didn't overthrow a functioning democratic government. They filled a power vacuum that had been created by the inability of moderate politicians to address the fundamental problems that had destroyed the Tsarist system in the first place. The Winter Palace, where Nicholas II had once held court in splendour that rivaled Versailles, was defended by a handful of military cadets and a women's battalion when the Bolsheviks finally moved to complete their takeover of the Russian government. The ministers who had claimed to represent the democratic aspirations of the Russian people were arrested without resistance and marched off to prison, while crowds that had once cheered their promises of reform watched with indifference. And so the Romanov dynasty died not with the clash of armies or the thunder of cannons, but with the quiet click of a prison door closing on the ministers of a government that had already ceased to exist. 304 years after a 16-year-old boy had been chosen from chaos to save Russia from itself, the last traces of imperial authority vanished into the revolutionary darkness of a St. Petersburg night. The family that had transformed a broken kingdom into the largest empire in human history, that had built palaces to rival the gods and commanded the loyalty of hundreds of millions, had become prisoners in their own land. Within months, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children would face their executioners in that basement in Siberia, their screams indeed swallowed by gunfire and revolution, just as this story began. But perhaps that's the most profound lesson of the Romanov saga. Power, no matter how absolute it appears, no matter how divinely it claims to be ordained, remains forever dependent on the consent of those who are governed. And when that consent is withdrawn, even 3 centuries of tradition, even the largest empire the world has ever known, can crumble in a matter of days. The shadows had finally consumed the throne.